Okay, for people joining this live stream, we are looking at some future ideas for Wolfram language, which may or may not be, I think these are post 13.1 for the most part. All right, we're looking at the concept of supplied. So,
Can you
guys,
increase the magnification a bit? I'm having a bit trouble seeing that actually on my laptop.
why? We usually should be fine. Okay, all right, fine.
Okay.
All right. For people who've been working with this dollar business, how is it feeling? It's a little bit ponderous looking.
Well, I don't think we've really implemented anything. We've implemented a version of supplied in tree map, which is the next agenda item, but there was this question.
I mean, we could do a bit of elision of those dollar things in terms of typesetting.
But I mean, this is something you would be typing in, right? I don't know that would.
Yeah, I know. It just looks kind of ugly in the code. I mean, we could stylize it slightly in terms of its display.
So I don't think I was here for the last meeting. I mean, why is it a double dollar sign?
Because we want to separate it from other things. And because we think there may be a lot of these. Right, we want to have them in their own sort of space, in a sense.
Right, so they're not sort of dollar variables, they're sort of magic.
How many functions are going to provide it?
Provide what? I mean, make use of it?
Right, yeah.
Lots in the end. I mean, it will gradually expand.
I mean, probably most functions that take a function as an argument could support supplied.
Yeah. I mean, there's going to be list manipulation, functional programming.
Global binding, is it?
What do you mean?
Well, how does that work with parallel? Yeah, I hope it's not super global.
Look, what it is it's got to go in, and upon evaluation here, it's got to be able to, this thing should be colon equaled effectively to a thing that goes and hunts its, internal data structure that represents the index in the map and makes use of it. It's not like if you go and, it's lexical, right? So it's got to be there. It's not going to go down in some sub thing of some sub piece of this deeply nested where there's an index there.
Right, there's that issue, and there's the issue of parallelism, right? That I guess, well, right. I mean, it sounds like basically the idea is that it's effectively like a module variable where it'll be sort of localized to lexically localized.
It's more like a width variable than a module variable.
Well, I say module just because I think the idea was that it would be lazy and it would be kind of set delayed like, as opposed to, so you don't actually have to compute the index or whatever it is if it's not going to be used.
Right. Well, but I think the idea, right. So look at the second in out. I think since we're still not agreed on what this is, right? So here's
this one here.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. So
I see.
So the dollar index gets immediately replaced before the function gets anything.
That's good.
With the one.
That's good as far as I'm concerned. That's better than what I was kind of implying with a, almost dynamic binding type thing.
Right. But so is it still sort of lazily computed? I mean, in index, it doesn't matter, but if there's something more expensive than index, it might.
I think it should be computed only. Look, you're not going to compute the whole list of 20 of these things and then do a with on them, if that's what you're asking. It'll have to scan this for the lexical presence of these things.
Right.
Fine, yeah.
And there isn't a way of passing in some argument that's an association.
We don't want that because we don't want to have pre-computed the association.
I mean, this was the original idea. Is that the problem is both that you have to compute all of the fields of the association every time, and they might not be as cheap as index. and then 2, that you have to actually construct the association, which is actually a significant slowdown. It also means that like I did some benchmarking with like map indexed. And so of course, because map indexed never compiles its function, unlike map, because it takes, because its second argument is some uncompilable format. And if you do certain operations, it's like dramatically slower. So that would be another reason. It's sort of in the same vein as why you don't want to always be passing in some giant association.
Right. I also think it's nice to be able to do this thing where you don't have to pre-armor plate this function, like with supplied, for instance.
Can you look at the second from the bottom input where you have just map of $$ index?
Yeah. What's wrong with that?
So the point is, this isn't reliant on the evaluator. So you see the $$ index is changing.
I see it, but how did you do that? I mean, is this just you just type?
These are all fake. These are all fake index. Nothing has been
association?
implemented.
Well, it's because it's changing the expression itself, not the arguments that it gets.
It's effectively,
Yes.
right. Normally you have to, you pass it a pure function. That's the variable scope. You imagine there's another level of pure function around the pure function that you give it that's replacing all of these, index and so on.
Yes. I get it. Right. I mean, that's like supplied is doing.
And if it's map at level 2, what's the index?
I think the idea is there would be
Last element of
position.
That's
Yeah, the position would be the one that,
$$ index would be the last value.
So there's another one. That's the list.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why you don't want to construct the association and why you want to be lazy, because there might be like, for map, I think we've talked about probably like 5 to 10 different things it could give.
Yeah, like fraction complete, like, all kinds of stuff.
Right.
Depth, which wouldn't be very interesting if, for
Well, it might if you're mapping at multiple levels.
No, absolutely. It's interesting. If it's a map all type thing, it absolutely is worth knowing what the depth is. It just isn't, I didn't finish my sentence. In this case, it isn't interesting.
Right.
Okay. So, the question here is, okay. So, do we think we understand the concept here? I don't, implementation is not obvious to me, but the concept would be that there are a whole family of $$ variables, which for a function like map, we would document a block of variables that are the things that are temporarily set. We can call them environment variables, maybe. That may be confusing.
That's super confusing.
Right. That was the working name we gave to them at 1 or 2 meetings ago, but I don't think anybody is going to champion that name.
Okay, well, fine. Supplied variables?
Contextual variables?
Yeah, contextual variables is closer, except for our contexts.
It'd be good to
maybe we should
just bound. Getting the word bound into them might be useful. Like
no, because they're not bound. They're not bound, Tom.
They get bound. No, they're always bound.
I don't think that's a useful way to think about it. I think what it more is, the main point here is that it is giving you, as Christopher says, it's giving you context for what's going on.
Right. Maybe it's worth looking at. We had like 75 different possible names for supplied. Maybe it's worth looking at what those names were, because I think it's the same thing.
No, supplied is different from environment variables.
Although there is this potential interaction between them, which is this, before I realized we weren't even all on the same page about what environment variables were, I thought was going to be the discussion point.
Well, okay, so hold on. By the way, this $$ index thing, whatever it is, there's also cases in rules where this should be used. Right?
The idea was that environment variables would work on the right.
Let's not call it an environment variable. Let's call them contextual variables. Okay.
Sure. The idea was that they would work on the right-hand side of rules. And
yeah, right. But I think environment variables is actually a bad name.
Okay.
Contextual is better.
Okay. So then, okay. Question: does somebody know how to implement these? Assuming that this design is what we want, but does somebody know how to implement them?
I don't think that's at all clear. And it probably will need to be done function by function.
Okay. I mean, what would happen? This thing is going to be scanned in some way with some optimized hashing type thing to know whether there are these things in it. If there are, it does this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. I mean, I think that's the only way. We need to lexically scan the input, just like in sort of supplied, we lexically scan things. And then the question is, how do supplied and contextual variables interact? Which is sort of
okay. I've got an outrageous suggestion.
Okay.
Which is to actually change this at parse time. If we see $$ variables.
Well, that's a macro language you're talking about there. It shouldn't be at parse time. It should be at a phase in between parsing and.
Well, okay.
That's what you're talking
hear
about.
me out, okay? Basic point is that I don't want us to have to, at runtime, go through every single maps, function payload and examine things about it. I mean, maybe it's stored in some kind of internal bits and things, which will be fine.
But you might have to, because the function might be passed in. It might be f equals a function, and then you do map of
All
f.
right. Okay.
I mean,
Well, I thought the idea is they would be lexical, so that wouldn't work.
Well, that would work.
But are they
That
lexical
would
with
work
respect-
if it's
hang
f
on.
equals. It will if it's f. If it's an own value, it absolutely would work, right? Because map isn't hold anything, so
are
that
they
would.
lexical with respect to the map or the function? Christopher.
Okay,
Well,
no,
You
it's I
guys
think
just
I've
blew up
answered
my
the question.
macro,
Yeah.
my pausing the macro idea. That won't work.
I mean, there
So,
are some cases where the
Christopher,
sort of parsing
Can
the
you tell
macro.
me, are these lexical with respect to the map or the function?
I think it's with respect to the map.
Okay,
Yeah.
fine.
Right, because there isn't necessarily any function, right, as we see in the second to last example.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think, right, I mean, yeah, I think that the sort of macro thing is sort of a bad idea in the sense that it introduces this whole giant,
It's a bad idea.
all the
Take it
absurdity.
off the
But it is also, I think that there are related issues, like for example, with confirm, confirm and close, there are related things about, well, how do you efficiently replace the confirms? And you kind of want to do that in a somewhat lazy way and so on. And yeah, right. I mean, I feel like generally speaking, we probably could have better sort of top level functionality for doing this kind of lexical scoping replacement.
Fair enough. But I mean, that relates to things in the X struct and so on that store potential information about what's inside there and so on. But okay, let's so tentatively we think
Hang on. There are still holes in this. If it's lexical with respect to the map, does that mean map has to hold its first argument?
no.
Then it can't be because map won't know what's there.
What do you mean?
Right. So if I type f equals, one of those functions with a $index in it, and then map of f, does that, does the index, is it active or not?
It is.
It
I mean,
is.
It
Map
knows
is
it's
effectively
lexical
running.
at the time of eating.
Right. The thing about it is map is effectively running replace all on its first argument for each iteration.
Yeah, fine. So it's not really lexical. It's not a lexical feature of map. It's in the function that's there.
But it's lexical in the function, as in it looks at.
Well, it's lexical in that if you wrote a function, right, you're somewhat right. I mean, it's lexical in the sense that if I wrote a function with down values, or if I wrote, f of hash ampersand and f used $index, then it wouldn't work. So it's not dynamic.
It would be possible to use caching. So that's for efficiency. It would be possible to use some sort of, weak cache mechanism on the thing. So you wouldn't have to repeatedly do this.
Fair enough.
You just have to do it once.
Sorry, what happens at higher levels?
What do you mean at higher levels?
What is $index if I'm mapping at level 2 instead of level 1?
We discussed that. It's the bottom one, and there's a position.
It's the index is last of position, which I guess means I don't know what it is if you map at level 0.
For tree map, I'm using none, which
whatever. I mean, that's the point is, just to make it clear, we made a list previously, I don't know where it is, of possible $, contextual variables, which include things like fraction complete.
That's in the supplied ref page. There's
Okay.
a featurized ref page.
Did you make that bigger?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, so there's all kinds of junk here.
Right, and there's even some like for fold. So another, right, I mean, this fold one, I'm guessing that it also, some of these require that folds store information that it wouldn't otherwise.
I think so. And by the way, I don't know how we really make this work. Well, this is for supplied, but a $, results
Yeah,
thing.
that's fair point. For environment variables, I don't.
Contextual variables.
Yeah, sorry.
I mean, maybe they could have sub values or I guess down values,
Maybe.
but it's sort of entering a whole bunch of other crazy stuff if you do that. I mean, there was an earlier alternative design for them before the $, idea, which was that there'd be some word. I mean, you'd say like, contextual variable of quotes result. And then of course you could have subsequent arguments, but it sounds like we've moved away from that.
I think we've moved away from that. Unless we made this thing actually change that syntax to something where this is a prefix function. And where this, like message, for example, picks up a string thing, and where there is a full form version of this.
I think that behavior of message name is usually very annoying and weird, honestly.
Okay. Well, okay, but I mean that's the alternative here, is that this could be, let's imagine it was, my gosh, we're really running out of characters here.
Maybe we need to get out the APL book.
All right, I'm going to make up just for the sake of having something, hash backtick. That's probably not even allowed. Okay, backtick star. That probably
just break out random choice if you at this point.
Yeah, right.
Well, back star is right, absolutely possible, right? If you have one.
Yes, I know it's ending. Yeah, right. Okay, well, look, let's say x times star, and I know that's possible for other things, right? I know that could be a multiplication of a factorial, but let's just assume it was something like this, and that turns into, contextualized index or something. I don't think it's completely crazy to imagine some kind of if we could come up with a syntax. I don't think that's completely crazy as an alternative to these variables like this. In fact, I kind of prefer it if we could come up with an ASCIified syntax, even though, look, I mean, less than works okay with string names, I think.
Unless it's a total model about what comes at the end of it.
Well, okay, this works okay with string names.
That worked okay.
And this would want to be something a bit like that.
I mean, that's how this all started, with the idea of using hash index.
Right, which won't work as such.
Right.
And it's much better to have just this thing whose value is index.
Maybe this could be something that has both a pre and an open and a close.
I see. Got any suggestions?
Not really. I mean, there are more open and closed ones. You have, colon greater, colon less than, bracket, colon. Yeah, right. I mean, there's several of these, but they're all very arbitrary is the problem.
Oh, looks quite nice. I mean, I could imagine if you saw that and we stylized that nicely, I can imagine that looking perfectly reasonable.
Is that a bracket or a brace? I can't quite tell at this size.
It's a bracket. Why is everybody having a hard time seeing my screen? It's 150%.
Well, I'm on a laptop today because of reasons, so things are smaller than usual.
Okay, fine. Okay, it's a
Well, I
bracket.
don't have my nice 4K monitor right now.
Okay.
This one
That
also
looks
has,
quite nice.
it looks like a goofy smiley face if you turn your head sideways.
Well, yes. I don't think that's horrible, syntax-wise. But and if we did that, I mean, actually, I'm kind of liking that a little bit better than having what looks like a global variable. All right, but
If we introduce syntax like this, though, I feel like we need to have a proper, this is a language construct. It's not just sort of like a function level construct. Like, I think we need to have top level functions that let you implement this for your own functions and stuff like that.
yes, okay, how would we do that?
And maybe one question is, how do we do that in a way that we're not basically implementing a whole parallel system to pure functions that's effectively the same, except it has different syntax?
Well, how would you specify that a function, let's say you have your own function, my map, and how would you, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but I was just going to point out that, there's also supplied. I mean, if we're making this so meta, I wonder if we still want supplied, which I guess supplied serves a slightly different need.
Yeah, so I think if we did this, then supplied could just still work with strings in the first argument. And you would use those same strings and contextualized.
Yes.
For this behavior.
Remind me why supplied is different.
So supplied is for function-like things, and it changes what arguments the thing gets wrapped around instead of changing the thing itself.
Right. So maybe if you look at the very first in out
of what
of this section.
I mean this one here.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, right. So, I mean, there's this question of what happens if you literally insert one of these contextual variables inside of supplied. But setting that aside, you see how the #2 gets replaced with 1 and 2 and 3 here because so that's right. That allows you to sort of reuse a multivariate function by sort of rewriting what arguments are fed to it. So that's what supplied does for you.
Right. So supplied of quotes index turns map into map indexed.
Yes.
Well, of quotes position, but yes.
Okay. Right. So map index, somewhat confusingly, is map of supplied position. Oops. F.
Yep.
Yeah, that's sort of interesting. So now written out in the other way, that will be map of f of hash, comma, which is also not terrible.
I agree that these would be similar, but they're
different. They're slightly different. Okay, to Christopher's point, for either of them, how do you provide, well, in the first, how would you make a pattern? I mean, this is like an options pattern type thing, which I always find a little hard to use, but how would you write a pattern that says map?
So I think what you want to do is you want to have a function where you give it the function wrapped in supplied, and then you give it some kind of like association or something where you basically tell it, here are all the different supplied variables that might be asked for, and here's what I want you to get, evaluate to get their values, but make sure you evaluate them in a kind of lazy but efficient and caching way.
But then I claim what that is going to be is something more like options pattern, where you say map of supplied pattern of f blank, comma, blah, 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 colon equals. And that has to be the thing that will match, a supplied pattern has to match supplied of blah, and so on. And then pick up the variables correctly.
So there are no new language features that need to be added in order for users to implement supplied on their own.
Well, but I think the point is we want some infrastructure because, for example, the fact that, supplied of a string in the first argument does the thing it does is,
Well, that's what I'm saying. Supplied can just be implemented, the same way you define any kind of pattern matching thing. It's the contextual variables that the users don't have a way to define themselves.
No, right. Of course, but it's just inconvenient. And we want to have
supplied, unless it immediately goes to a canonical form, it's not easy to implement. Right, because I mean, go ahead.
I would argue doing it through at the pattern matching phase is not super useful, especially because it's not even. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like it's more of a like supplied is something that's kind of like a function, but it's not. It's a wrapped function, and just as you can use apply to apply a function, I think there should be some like supplied apply or something like that. Apply supplied that kind of will apply it and intelligently, feed in the correct inputs.
Except that it can only happen contextually.
Like there's no reason that supplied can only be used in the arguments to a function anyway. Like
yes, no, absolutely. Supplied cannot. You can't just take a supplied and then apply it to some arguments. It means nothing.
No, right, of course.
A map. Or on the right hand side, like a vertex shape function could be a supplied.
Right, but I'm just saying that there could be a more general function called like apply supplied or something like that, which is conceptually how you would implement this if you were implementing your own version of map or whatever.
Where would it get its arguments from?
Well, I guess I don't understand that claim because I think it precisely can't exist. Like
no, because the argument structure
give it the explicit context.
It's not the argument structure of apply. It's you give it the supplied object or a function, and it would of course automatically promote it to a supplied object. Then you give it, the arguments that, for example, that map traditionally gives, #1, #2 or something like that. And then you give it some sort of like association or something where you basically tell it, here's how to get, if you need to know what the index is, here's how you can get it. If you need to know what this is, here's how you get it, and so on. And then it just, looks at the supply, looks at its first argument, and feeds the correct things to it.
So you'd have to compute an association.
You have to
you'd have to give it an association that, like, I don't know exactly what the right structure for that would be, but you would not give it an association for each iteration. You would sort of somehow. Right, I see. I mean, you need to have some sort of structure.
I guess I just don't see how I would use apply supplied to implement supplied, given the way that I implemented it already. Which is not constructing associations. It's just lazily you know, I just have a pattern and I know what the elements are, and then I replace them at the last second.
This requires more thought. What should we look at right now? Because this is going to require more offline thought. And I think we've got. Go ahead.
Right. So, I mean, the one thing on this agenda that's important for 13.1 is that, you know, we did implement a supplied for tree map. And so, you know, we need to review that. And, you know, are we okay if supplied is only going to exist in this one experimental function? Are we okay not having a ref page for supplied?
I'm not keen on this. I mean, how important is it? I mean,
well, so we already removed all the code and documentation for extended level specs. And so this is like a better version of that. We used to say level spec arrow, and then you could say data or subtree. But now this effectively can do map indexed and all of these other things as well.
Are we really happy with the name supplied? Wouldn't contextualize be better, except it's longer?
We considered that was rejected for some reason. I don't remember what.
Context, probably.
You're thinking having a name that more closely is in line with the name that we're saying for the contextual variables wrapper?
Yeah, but I'm not sure that that's right either.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm not sure you know, if the idea is these are two different things, then I don't think giving them the same name is a good idea.
Well, I think the strings are the same, but it's that supplied is for the arguments and contextual variables is for the expression itself.
Is there any way we can get away in this version with some ornate syntax for tree map that doesn't introduce the supplied function?
Could we use rule?
Probably.
I mean, then you can't map a rule, but
Well, there are ways around that, right? With like you hold pattern or verbatim of the rule, just like you do in cases. I mean, you'd have to work a little bit extra to catch that case, but
the only problem is that I can see, you know, then that syntax is not. Oh boy, I'm not happy with this because this syntax is very bleeding edge and flaky. Is there any wrapper that we could provide? I mean, unfortunately, more or less any function f could go in that first argument.
right.
What is the defensive way to do this?
We could put it back into the level spec for now.
Which would work how?
You'd say level spec arrow LMs and just have the LMs work the way supplied is working in terms of, you know, if you don't have a list, it's an additional argument. If you do have a list, it's a sequence of arguments.
I think that would be the more defensive thing to do. Anybody else got comments on that? I just don't think it's the right thing to introduce this, you know, hair on the tail of the giant dog where we're only introducing the hair of the tail.
Either way will break the level spec arrow notation that we had before. So from the perspective of trees, either is fine.
Which notation that we had before?
In 13.0 and earlier, you can say level spec arrow LM. And that is equivalent to supplied of a singleton list containing LM.
But that's already in.
What do you mean?
Like it's already in released versions? Is this level spec arrow syntax?
Yeah, the level spec arrow syntax is in released versions, but it does not behave the same way that supplied behaves.
Why?
It's effectively list LM. It replaces the one argument that you have with a different one, whereas supplied of LM is an additional argument in addition to the data.
I see. What do we think is more useful?
I think the additional argument is probably more useful, but I think if it's just a matter of having, yeah, I think it's not so tragic that with this older syntax to have to write more stuff. It seems like that we should just keep it that way.
You can grandfather this older syntax for now. I don't think it's not harmful, is it?
I'm saying I can keep the syntax, but I'll have to change the behavior of the syntax.
No, only if subtree is reused as an element.
It is. A data subtree and original subtree are used and supplied, and then we added a bunch of.
So why do you have to change can't it just be that if you want this 2-argument behavior, you just write more stuff? You just write, I don't know what it is, quote subtree, comma, the element.
You're saying get rid of the additional argument thing for now.
Yeah. Just for this older syntax.
So you'd say list data, comma, index in order to have the index as an additional argument. Right,
which is not great. But if we think that we're going to, if we think that in the next version or something, we're going to have this beautiful supplied thing, then it's not that bad either.
I agree. Why break compatibility with the previous thing for a notation that's not going to work long term anyway?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. But so that puts pressure on here for, we got to think through this contextualized variables thing.
Are we fine with the actual strings being used? Things like level, negative level, level pair.
I don't see why not.
Okay.
Okay. Right, but we need to push forward on getting. How much of an inventory of where we could use the supplied concept do we have, system-wide, so to speak?
I think just the ref page, which is like the core functional language programming stuff.
Which ref page? The ref page for supplied.
Yeah.
Where's the rule stuff?
Right, I didn't do that.
Okay. Okay. There's all kinds of weird places this could be used. Like for instance, there's all kinds of weird things like switch statements where you could say which element of the switch statement you're in. That's kind of crazy.
Yeah, I don't even know what that means.
Well, I guess the point is
What was the pattern?
Never mind.
Yeah.
Never mind. You've lexically determined that anyway. So qualitatively, what this is for, and this relates to our next meeting probably. As you're walking through a symbolic expression, this is kind of telling you, which might be a being created symbolic expression. This is kind of telling you where you are. This is the context of where you are in that traversal, I think. Is that right? That's what all these functions are doing in some way.
Mm-hmm. For example, a nest, you're constructing.
Right. Okay, well, look, we're wimping a little bit for this version here, but I think, right, one question is, if we did supplied without the $$ contextualized, whatever, is it still useful?
Yes.
We really want the other stuff. particularly if we had a nice short name for supplied. I think it could be, and then we see how it goes in terms of its use, because the other case of it, the other syntax for it, is merely a shortening, isn't it? There's nothing you can achieve with it you cannot achieve with supplied.
There are things that each of them can achieve that the other can't.
Okay, what can the $$ thing achieve?
For one, it can be used on the right-hand side of a rule. And two, it's actually changing the, like say in map, you say map F comma whatever. If that F expression lexically contains the contextual variable, then that means you're changing the F that you're mapping.
Yeah, okay. Which is a slightly obscure operation.
Mm-hmm. I mean that way things like mapping over a held expression still just like work.
Yes, I realize.
Mm-hmm.
But the supplied thing is already useful. And by the way, presumably plugs directly into various kinds of progress reporting and so on.
To the extent these elements are implementable.
Well, that's a question. I don't know the answer to that. And you guys should look at that. Well, we've clearly got more to discuss on this. This is a very good concept. The whole thing is a good concept. All right, I think we got to go here, and some of you are also in the next meeting.
Yeah, this one is sort of more. This is not something I think we should
Not a quick
tackle right
thing.
now.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, if we need to end, like I said, none of these. The Lambda discussion might be a bit interesting to Mark and Tom as well as Christopher, right? We were asking about how what notations do other languages have for Lambda, because we were, and like what might be a match fix notation that we could use, assuming we want yet another syntax for
the main problem being, how do you get, given all the precedence issues? I mean, this doesn't cut it, obviously, because that's got as many parentheses as anything.
Yep.
It's kind of like, you launch with a Lambda, and then you have to, I don't know what you do to delimit it.
I mean, I kind of worry a little bit about having another syntax for this where it's not clear what the difference is. I mean, I think either we say this is the new syntax, that's replacing ampersand, which is kind of dramatic, or it's people are just going to be confused.
Well, I don't know about that. I think the arrow isn't confusing. I mean, confusion. F at X, X / F, that does not lead to a lot of confusion.
Right, but it's also, I feel like if there are then like now 4 different syntaxes for writing pure functions, you can write with function, you can write with the fancy arrow, you can write with ampersand, and then now you can write it with some prefix ampersand.
Well, this is a match.
Sorry, what was the first one?
You can write it with the
literal function.
Yeah.
Oh,
full
okay.
form.
Full form, yeah. I mean, right. So I don't feel like full form counts, right? Full form, right? Everything has a full form. So right.
Well,
so
like at the summer school, for example, like people people who are like learning the language, and people still ask me like, oh, when should I write out function full form versus when should I use the arrow versus when should I use the ampersand? And it's like, you might think, oh, well, it's obvious, it's whichever one's most convenient. But I think just having, different options already kind of confuses people.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's whichever is most convenient, right? It's do you want named variables or not, right? I mean, you use ampersand when you're using slot, and you use the arrow when you're using, bound variables.
But when do you use the arrow versus writing out function? I mean, for me, it's when basically the precedence, depends on how the precedence works.
Right.
But
Yeah.
Also function for 3 arguments.
Or yes, right. So you have to use function for 3 arguments, and also, when I want to make it look more mathy, I use the arrow, fancy arrow.
And also when it happens to be an argument of a function like nest graph or something, or nest or something, where there's no precedence issue.
Right.
The point is just that these are distinctions that are, if you just showed someone not familiar with the language, here are the syntaxes for pure functions, it's not immediately obvious why you'd need these and where you'd use them. That's just my point.
Right. And Christopher, you weren't here for the previous round of the discussion, but my opening gambit in that discussion was, what exactly are we trying to achieve with yet another notation for functions? So
right.
Yeah, well, okay. I mean, I was thinking if we could actually get a thing that looked like a lambda, it might be nice, but it doesn't look like that syntactically, that precedence-wise works. All right, we need to go to the next meeting.
okay.
So